Welcome to the Madrona Group's 15-minute forms, where we pick a form to talk about for 15 minutes and hope to develop a better understanding of it. Today, we're going to talk about the 22B, which is the Home Sale Contingency form. Now, this form is quite complicated, and although we are condensing this into 15 minutes, we do have a full version of this video on our YouTube page and our Madrona resource page. So when would you use a Form 22B? Well, the Form 22B, being the home sale contingency, means that in order for your client to purchase a home, they must sell another property before that happens. That sale will be contingent on the sale of the previous property selling. So when we are looking at this as a big picture, we want to ask them first, do they have to sell in order to buy their next property? If the answer is yes, we are definitely going to want to use the 22B. And remember, as with every transaction, we need to disclose where all of the money is coming from to pay for the purchase if it is not already cash available in a bank account in the US. So this is what the home sale contingency form looks like. It's a 2-page document, and by inserting this into the purchase and sale agreement, you are telling the other party that you are conditioned on the sale of the home identified from this form. The form is pretty easy to fill out in general, but understanding it is another thing. So I'm going to go over very quickly how to fill it out, but also more the understanding of what some of these implications are. So when you have a home sale contingency, they are going to be selling the property at the departing home, the home they have to sell in order to purchase the next one. So that's what you're going to fill out in paragraph 1. Now, the default time to sell the property is 45 days. And to sell means that they have a mutually accepted contract. So that timeline can be adjusted depending on what the market's doing or how aggressive you want to make your offer to that seller. Now, there are 2 things that need to happen in order to do this. Number 1, you have to list the property, and that means it defaults to 5 days. If that property is not listed by the time specified below, your buyer has no protections in this entire purchase and sale. It is one of the most consequential things that can happen in a purchase and sale agreement contract. So if you're putting in a home sale contingency, make sure that the house actually gets listed, or the property gets actually listed by the time it's specified in paragraph 1. Now, paragraph 1B does define what it means to have sold something. And once you do have a contract that is mutually accepted for this property that the buyer needs to sell, we do need to give notice of doing so. This form lays out the notice forms numbers that you should be reaching for once those actions happen. Now, there are 2 things that could happen where you would need consent immediately from that seller in order to accept an offer. The first one is if the buyer of that property is going to be accepting another offer that does have a contingency. Now, that contingency can be something that needs to, the property needs to go on the market, or it could be something that they're currently pending and under contract for. But in either case, unless the buyer is coming to the table with an offer without those 2 contingencies, you need the seller's permission first. The second part is if there is a closing that is either extended or expedited. And it is defined in 2B as being less than 30 days or more than 45 days. So when accepting an offer on a contingent home sale, make sure you're also checking the closing date and making sure it falls within those parameters. If it does not fall within either of these parameters, there is a form to get permission from the seller to accept that offer. If one of these offers is accepted without the seller's permission, the seller does actually have the right to terminate the contract and keep the earnest money. So make sure that you are communicating very well what is happening with the departing property. Now, with this contingency, a loan may also be used as well. If a loan is used and the application for that loan is going to be done within 5 days of the mutually accepted purchase and sale agreement from this 22B contract, meaning the new property that the client is purchasing, then that timeline starts at mutual acceptance with the new property. If you want to have your client apply for financing after the departing property has gone under contract, you have that option for the selection. But even including the 22B, all timelines with that contract being mutually accepted for the new property are going to start at mutual acceptance with the new property. When we walk into this contract, we need to keep that in mind for earnest money delivery, application for a loan if necessary, any other contingencies that are within the contract. They all start at mutual acceptance with the new property. Now, in order to do this and keep in good faith, your buyer is going to need to keep their property they need to sell on the market for the length of time specified. Now, the length of time specified was back in the first paragraph. And in that timeline, that does not mean you can take it off the market, put it back on the market. The buyer is going to actively be trying to sell their property in order to purchase the new one. Now, there is an end date for this because all contracts have to have a date of completion. Now, the property can remain on the market and you have your expiration up at the top. When it comes to being able to give notice or a bump notice, that seller that the buyer is purchasing a property with has the right to still try to market their own property. And it's possible that this contingent buyer could be bumped out of the way. Paragraph 4 lines out exactly the timeline necessary for the buyer's reply if the seller does get another offer before the buyer waives this home sale contingency or satisfies it. The default time to do so is 5 days. This means if this buyer is under contract and the seller receives another offer that they'd like to accept instead of the contingent offer, they give notice to the buyer. The buyer then has, at default, 5 days to either waive the home sale contingency and close the sale, let the seller know that they did not sell the house and they have to bow out of the contract, or within those 5 days, they could get under contract and satisfy the home sale contingency. All of these contingencies with notices do have a form number that is referenced in the 22B. And because there are so many notices and so many moving parts to this form, the Northwest MLS has laid out exactly how to respond to each of these situations as listed in each of their paragraphs. Now, once the contingency has been satisfied, once the buyer has accepted an offer, the buyer needs to notify the seller within 2 days of mutually accepting that offer for their property that they needed to sell. When they do that, they're going to give notice on the 90K, which is spelled out in paragraph 5. And then that contingency is considered satisfied. A satisfaction of this contingency does not waive everything else that was in this contingency. It just says the buyer has done their job trying to sell the house, and in return gets to have the protections that are still awarded to them for following all the rules. There are options if a buyer's property fails to close. If a buyer gets under contract early and their buyer falls out of contract, the whole timeline of this contingency still survives until it expires. The buyer still has opportunities to go ahead and try to sell it to another buyer. On the flip side of that, it's not only an opportunity, but it's also a requirement. It's also a requirement because in the contract, they told their second property seller that they were going to continually try to sell their property and make this work for a specified amount of time. If the sale falls through and it is beyond the contingency, then the contingency just goes away. The sale terminates. Now, if the sale of the buyer's property, the departing property, fails to close, but for no fault of the buyer, after the expiration of the contingency, then the agreement is going to terminate unless this contingency has been waived. So this contingency is just in place for a specified amount of time where the buyer has that amount of time to try to sell their home, get it under contract, and then move towards a closing with sale number 2. There are other dates in this that are affected directly. The 22B is going to be one of the only forms that we don't need to write a closing date on our the first page of our purchase and sale agreement. The closing date of this second sale is going to be 3 days after the closing of the buyer's property sale. So when the buyer has a home to sell, when that house sells, the next property closes 3 days later. You don't need to identify a closing date. It is an automatic 3 days. And remember, our 3 days are not including weekends or holidays. If the buyer gets bumped because another offer came in and the buyer is unable to move forward in the transaction, the buyer's earnest money will be protected. So what are some sort of buyer bewares when it comes to this form? Buyers need to be aware that they have to follow all the rules in this contingency in order to keep the protection of that contingency. So make sure that your buyer is very aware that it needs to meet the list date, has to go live on the Northwest MLS. They cannot do a for sale by owner. It has to have an offer accepted that is within the parameters allowed to be accepted. Has to have an offer that closes more than 30 days, but less than 45 days unless you get seller consent. We need to make sure that our buyers are not accepting an offer that's contingent as well without getting seller consent. So seller consent and communication is key when you represent a buyer with a home sale contingency. On the seller side of things, the seller needs to be aware that they are going to be taking their home off the market, waiting for a buyer to sell their home first. So you're going to have extended closing times. The seller also needs to be aware that it is possible the deal could fall through and the buyer may be unable to purchase the property. In either case, whoever you represent, just make sure that you do go over the pluses and minuses of using this. It is not a scary situation, and this is something that is normal practice. So if you find yourself with a seller that's concerned or a buyer that's concerned about using the home sale contingency, please reassure them that in our market, sometimes it's necessary to sell a property first, and this is the way we do it. If you have any questions about this form or any other form, please feel free to reach out.